Good afternoon. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good afternoon. Our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by American Jewish Committee. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Yesterday, AJC launched a new limited podcast series, The Forgotten Exodus, exploring the rich heritage of the over 800,000 Jews who left or were driven from their homes in Arab nations and Iran. Joining us today to celebrate this launch and to dive into those personal stories are Carol Isaacs, musician, cartoonist, and author of The Wolf of Baghdad, and Manya Brachear Pashman, host of AJC's People of the Pod and The Forgotten Exodus. Moderating today's conversation is AJC Los Angeles Associate Director, Dr. Saba Sumek. After we hear from our guests, time permitting, we will take your questions. You may email your question to questions@ajc.org, questions is plural, or use the Q&A feature in Zoom. And Saba, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Claire. Welcome, viewers and podcast listeners, to our celebration of the premiere of American Jewish Committee's newest podcast, The Forgotten Exodus, the untold stories of Jews from Arab lands, Iran. I'm Saba Sumek, Assistant Director of AJC Los Angeles. I'm also a longtime professor of religious studies and Middle Eastern history. I was born in Tehran, and my family fled right before the Iranian Revolution. For all those reasons, knowing these voices and these stories are finally getting the attention they deserve brings me tremendous joy. The Forgotten Exodus is the first ever narrative podcast series to exclusively focus on these often forgotten stories of Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, and it's about time. The many courses I took about the Middle East and North Africa throughout my undergraduate and graduate studies ignored the histories, culture, and traditions of Jews and other religious minorities in the Middle East. It was as if we did not exist outside of an Islamic focus of academia. The Forgotten Exodus shifts that phenomenon at an incredibly important time. Here to talk about the genesis of this and to share more of the story featured in the premiere episode on Jews from Iraq is host Manya Brachear Pashman and the star of the premiere episode, cartoonist and musician Carol Isaacs, the author of the graphic memoir, The Wolf of Baghdad. Ladies, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saba.
So before we launch our conversation, I want to invite you, Carol, to set the mood, if you will, with an Iraqi melody.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to play a little tune. It's an Iraqi traditional folk melody, and it's called Chimali Wali. And in English, that means no one to watch over me. It's kind of like a lament of things past. You can hear me? Oh, I have to say before I start, it's a little known fact that Iraqi Jews wrote most of the popular music of Iraq and across the Middle East in the last century. In fact, tunes that are still popular today.
Thank you, Carol. That was beautiful. I hope maybe we could do a future podcast, maybe on the music coming out of the Middle East, because that was really, really lovely. So thank you for setting the mood for that. Manya, as Carol's putting everything away, I'm going to go to you with the first question. So Manya, can you provide some background on this podcast? How did it come about? What were some of the challenges you dealt with?
So I wish I could take credit for the idea, but I absolutely can't because it came up in my job interview when I was interviewing for a position at AJC. The person who was interviewing me proposed this idea for a series of audio stories, a podcast series that shared the stories of Jews from Arab lands and Iran. And I had no idea what he was talking about, quite frankly. He had been inspired by a 2017 piece that AJC CEO David Harris had written called Letter from a Forgotten Jew. And it was this incredibly moving column, which I then went and read after the interview. And it talks about Jews from Libya, Jews from Iraq, the Jews who left in the Babylonian exile after the destruction of the first temple, which is kind of I mentioned that with Tisha B'Av approaching this weekend. I mean, these Jews lived in these lands for thousands of years, and they were ousted from these lands, expelled, threatened, escaped. I had really no concept of that. As you said, Saba, in your introduction, that just was never covered in my world history classes, nor any of my Jewish history classes. It was never brought up, and so I was intrigued, and I hoped that if I got the job, this would be one of the projects that I tackled, and indeed it was. So,
well, we're so grateful to you and AJC for doing this. And Carol, let's move on to you. You wrote this wonderful graphic novel. Graphic memoir, I should say. What was the process of putting this together? And can you tell us the significance behind the meaning of Wolf of Baghdad?
I'll deal with the second question first. The Wolf of Baghdad, the title came from a book I happened to be reading about the Jews of Baghdad. It was written in 1917. And in the chapter marked Myths and Superstitions, there's a little bit about how the Jews of Baghdad were rumored to have kept a wolf in their cellar in order to protect their children, that would keep away the evil eye, it would keep away the jinn. And I was really intrigued by this fact. And when I investigated some more, I realized that actually I've got this thing. I don't know if you can see it. It's an amulet that apparently used to be tied to my crib. It belonged to my mother, probably her mother before her, and it's a wolf's tooth. So I went and looked, and I found out that, yes, indeed, this is a well-known myths and superstitions. Jews of Iraq had very many of them. And when I delved even further amongst the Bedouin, I met some Bedouin in Jordan. They said the same thing, that they believed the wolf was a very strong and a protector of themselves. And they would use these amulets also to protect themselves. The book came about because I'd done a short story about what it's like to be growing up as an English girl in an Iraqi home in England. And I thought maybe I could expand it and turn it into a full-length graphic memoir.
That's amazing. And my book on Iranian Jewish women, I have just a whole chapter on amulets to ward off the evil eye. It is an important aspect of Middle Eastern Jewish culture and history, and one that mostly the women are responsible for. You're not a good wife or grandmother unless you ward off the evil eye from your grandchildren and children. Thank you so much for that, Carol. And for both of you, and Manya, I'll go to you first. Did you feel that people were reluctant to talk about their history? Why do you think yes or no? And I could, talk about that with my research, but I would love to first go to both of you and discuss, did people easily talk about their history in the Middle East and as Jews?
Once I was able to convince people to share their stories with me, yes, I mean, they opened up and shared their stories in great detail. I will say it was difficult. The challenge was finding people who were willing to share their stories to begin with. I blamed the pandemic because I was trying to do this during that just as that started. But I also spoke with people in this world who advocate for Mizrahi and Sephardic communities, and they shared with me that really there are a couple reasons why people might have been reluctant. One being that these stories have been forgotten. These people have been here for years and no one asked. They've been ignored, and that there was a sense of alienation and bitterness that no one had asked, and kind of a little too late kind of approach when the stranger calls them up and asks them to share their stories. But there was also a tendency I encountered that they just wanted to leave the past in the past. They wanted to move forward. These were incredibly traumatic times. Their families for generations had lived in these lands, and these people had dreams and aspirations and ambitions and had made significant progress toward those dreams and aspirations. And they threw that all away in order to save their families' lives, right? In many of these cases. And so this was an incredibly traumatic
Yes.
and they didn't want to share that with the stranger when she called. So I did encounter that reluctance.
Right, right. Thank you so much, Manya. Carol, how about you?
I never really heard much about, we were, to all intents and purposes, a British family. My father wore a pinstripe suit and a bowler hat, put the copy of The Guardian under his arm, and he went off to the city every day to work. He was a city gent, he was English as English can be. It was only until the last few years when I started delving into this and thinking more about it, I realized I never heard the word refugee or stateless person when I was growing up. It was as if our life had always been in England, in London specifically. And talking to the family, all of them, they were wonderful. They were very generous with their time, and they told me their memories because I wanted to tell the story through their words. And they were very kind, and they told me all that they knew. That's how I got to the book.
That's wonderful, because my experience was very different. I interviewed 120 women ages 18 to 90 who are Iranian Jews in Los Angeles, because obviously I couldn't interview the Jewish community in Iran. It was too dangerous. But I found that the women were very, very reluctant, and mostly because they were women and they were not used to having people interested in their stories. So when I was going to an 80, 90-year-old woman and asking about what was it like getting married at 12 years old, having 10 children, moving in with your in-laws, escaping a revolution, they didn't even understand why I'd be interested in them. And so for a very long time, it took a long time for me to coax them into even meeting with me. And I think the reason why they did was because I am an insider in the community, and I wasn't someone who's Ashkenazi or just a scholar coming in. So they were able to build that trust. But I think, Manya, you're also right. There's a lot of trauma, and people, when they move and they escape, they're just in survival mode. So in a lot of ways, they try to leave that trauma, and then coming back in, and I would do these interviews and people would just start hysterically crying. And it was just triggering a lot, especially in communities that everything is, what we say in Farsi, behind the curtain, meaning closed, and you don't talk about family grievances in public. And therapy is not a part of Middle Eastern Jewish culture. It is now, but it's not for the older generation. So they never had that outlet for that trauma. So thank you both for that. And Carol, what was the response of your family and the Iraqi Jewish community to your book, and then also the non-Iraqi Jewish community?
It's quite remarkable on both counts. I don't know if you know this, but it's also an animation, what we call a motion comic, where the pages of the book are projected on a screen, and an ensemble plays underneath like a silent movie and accompanies the unfolding narrative, which is mostly wordless. So the story is told through the music. Anyway, we did one of these performances, one of the premieres, and actually the first night, the Israeli embassy came. The second night, the Iraqi embassy came. They loved it. I have to tell you, both embassies. But as we do normally, we had a Q&A after each performance, because we find that people want to ask a lot of questions about, what is this, who are you? And in one of the Q&As, one of my aunts, who's related to me in my marriage, stood up and spoke about things that I'd never heard her say before, which was amazing to me. And someone else said that after the performance was finished, all the Iraqi Jews left with their heads a bit higher, walking an inch taller. And I thought, wow, my job is kind of done in that respect. I was a bit nervous. I wasn't sure how the family and the wider family would take it. But in
Right.
terms of the wider Iraqi diaspora, they've been amazing. I've made so many great friends from Iraqis who are living in the UK, and also Iraqis in Iraq itself, non-Jewish. They've been incredibly supportive and very interested in what I'm doing.
That's wonderful. We do see a resurgence of interest in the Middle East and North Africa, these forgotten Jewish communities. And it's wonderful to see that there is an interest, of course, within the Jewish community, but amongst the non-Jewish community. And Carol, still back to you. Iraq in 1941 went through a major crisis, Iraqi Jews, that most people aren't familiar with, and that's called the Farhood. Can you describe that? Can you describe its impact on your family, and if you feel like there's generational trauma in your community from that?
It wasn't just the one incident, which was the pogrom, the Farhood. That's an Arabic word for a terrible event. It was an accumulation of things. From the 1930s, there was a link between Iraq and Hitler's Germany. There was, for example, there was a broadcast in Arabic from Berlin. Hitler's book was published and serialized in Arabic. And there was a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of people turning against each other, a drip effect throughout the 30s. In fact, in 1939, I believe, or was it 37, the Iraqi school system put the German model of teaching onto their system and taught it throughout the country. So there was a lot of German influence. As for the Farhood itself, in my family, a lot of the younger members don't remember much of what happened, but the older ones just told me of terrible things happening, and that they just stayed where they were. They were terrified. They couldn't leave their houses. And several of them told me, in fact, that their Muslim neighbors protected them from the mobs. Some of them stood with guns at the end of their street and said, "You will not come here. These are my cousins. These are my friends." A lot of people lost their homes. Many died. We still don't know how many today. And it was kind of the beginning of the end of the Jewish community in Iraq. They felt they were no longer welcome there anymore, their home, that had been their home for so long.
And do you feel like there's generational trauma from that, even for family members who did not experience it in your community?
I don't know. My parents never talked about it. Only recently, when I pushed and I asked my family for their memories of Iraq, both good and I said also the bad, it started to come out bit by bit. And I was really quite astounded at what I was hearing. I'd never heard that before.
Right. It's when you really start probing that you start hearing it.
Yeah.
And, Carol, in so many ways, I could relate to you and the nostalgia for a country you don't know. I was born in Iran, but I've never been back. My books are about Iran. I teach about Iran and Iranian Jewish communities. But, I lived in India, so I know the streets of Mumbai better than I know the streets of Tehran. And you described it beautifully as a sense of nostalgia for a country you've never been to. What does that mean to you, and how has that fueled your work?
When I read this word, it's in Finnish. It's one of those words that's untranslatable. You need like a whole paragraph. Kaukukaipu is the word in Finnish, and it means a nostalgia or homesickness or a longing for a place that you've never been. And I thought, my goodness, this is exactly how I feel about Iraq. I have never been there, but I've heard little bits here and there from my family. It was really all about the good stuff, the family times, the traditions we had. My childhood was peppered with these reminiscences. And all my life, I've thought of Baghdad as this place that lives in my family's memories as a kind of a magical place somehow. Of course, I found out the truth when I was researching for the book, but it was always this place that would be denied to me somehow.
Right.
I nearly went a couple of years ago, but thanks to COVID, and I have been invited a couple of times to go. I mean, I will go one day.
You do see yourself going one day?
Yeah. I mean, not to see, there's nothing left of my family there. Even my grandparents' graves have gone. It's been Saddam Hussein made a highway through their cemetery. But just to, I don't know, breathe the same air that they breathe, be on the same soil that they were, and just meet these new friends who are kind of coming at me from Iraq, surprisingly.
Right.
Want to connect, want to build a bridge, who want to talk to me, who want to know our history. That's amazing to me.
And Carol, how are they finding you? Is it through your book? How do they know about this in Iraq?
Anyway, when I started researching the book, I did some research and development. And during that time, I kept a blog of my progress. And I found that I had lots of readers for some reason in the Middle East, and some in Iraq, and some on Facebook too. And I connected with them, and they were asking me questions, and I asked them favors. I wanted to get the backgrounds right. So I said to these two young Muslim students in Baghdad, would you mind going and just taking some photographs of the old city? I want to see what it's like, what it looks like now. And they sent that to me. And I've made new connections in Iraqi Kurdistan as well, which I'll talk about.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's been awesome. It's been really, it's not what I expected to happen at all.
That's wonderful. I am, as a scholar, because I can't go to Iran, I depend on my Iranian Muslim students to, when they go back every summer, to then come back and tell me what's going on. So in so many ways, it's, I'm the scholar, but they're really informing me on what's going on there because I just can't go back. And, Carol, I think one of the biggest compliments for a writer is when high schools adopt your book because they believe that it's an important tool to use to educate their students. And your book is now being used and integrated into middle schools and high school curriculums. Can you talk about that, and how did that come about?
That, again, it's beyond madness. It's just wonderful to hear that. I don't know, a publishing company contacted me. They'd seen The Wolf, and they thought it would I could do an adaptation for middle grade. And I went, okay, I'll give it a go. And I did. And apparently some schools are taking it on board, and that is amazing. But also, what is wonderful to me is that university in Iraqi Kurdistan want to have The Wolf of Baghdad on their undergraduate literature prospectus syllabus for their students in English literature, which to me is, again, quite mind-blowing. And
That's
I'm
amazing.
so excited. Yeah.
Have you been invited to any universities to speak, or?
I was invited, and I did a lecture for them last year, and they were utterly delightful. They asked the most intellectual and sensitive questions. Their English was perfect, by the way, I have to tell you, and they were really wonderful.
Oh, that's wonderful. That's really great. And, talking about schools and contexts and teaching this history, and Manya and Carol, this is for both of you, and Manya, we'll start with you. There's a big gap regarding Mizrahi stories and history in school curriculums. As I talked about, I never even learned about my own history, and I did Jewish studies literally from preschool up until my PhD. Can you discuss this gap regarding Holocaust history and the lack of Mizrahi narrative in the Jewish Ashkenazi normative settings? Manya, I'll go to you with that.
Well, you used the right word. It's Ashka normative, right? I mean, it's everything is, it seems that Jewish history is framed in this Ashkenazi centric context that, of course, I read the diary of Anne Frank in the 8th grade, and I was fortunate to have a good world history teacher in high school who we talked about the Holocaust. And, when you go to Holocaust museums, it often is focused on the European, the Holocaust of Germany and Poland. You miss that that the Nazis did reach across and around the world. I mean, I believe, Carol, you were telling me that planes were flying, or perhaps it was in your memoir, that planes flew above Iraq and dropped pamphlets. There was an influence that spread. But then there's also just the what was happening on the ground there, the tensions, the creation of Israel, all of that hostility is just ignored, and you don't hear about it. And I think that's a shame, because that's really leaving out a huge piece of Jewish history, period. Right?
Absolutely.
Not just Jewish history. One of the takeaways from this series is that, I learned a lot about the British Empire and Italy, and all of these empires around the world, and they played a role in this history, and you have to understand all of it in order to really understand what's going on now.
Right. Carol, would you like to add to that?
Well, when I was growing up, I knew much more about the history of European Jews as well. I didn't really know anything about our history because that really was all that there was. And still today, you meet people who don't realize that Jews came from other countries. You know, they came from they were indigenous to the Middle East. They came from places as far away as Yemen and Egypt and Lebanon and Syria. They don't realize. So I'm glad that this podcast series is going ahead because it will educate us all even more.
Right. I don't think most people realize that Haji Amin, you had the Nazis and the collaboration in Palestine at that time, and that if the war didn't end, our families would be then moving on to concentration camps and stuff too. And so it was all over the Middle East. And the Ba'ath Party, as you said, in Syria and Iraq were the first to translate Mein Kampf into Arabic. So you had a lot of that. And if viewers are interested and listeners are interested, two great scholars who look at the Holocaust in North Africa, they're out of UCLA, Sarah Stein and Omar Boom, and they've written a lot about that. And when I was at UCLA full time, we actually did a whole 4-part series lectures on the Holocaust in North Africa and the Vichy regime and Morocco, Tunisia, et cetera. So there's a lot of history there. And it's becoming a popular thing to look at, luckily. But the Jewish day schools and the high schools and the colleges are still not really focusing on it. If, there's time a week right before school's out, then they'll look at the Mizrahi community and the Sephardi community. And so that's something that really needs to change in the curriculums. And, I live in Los Angeles, and California has been battling this ethnic studies curriculum. And the original ethnic studies curriculum was written by professors that were very pro boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel, very, it's blatantly anti-Semitic in their approach to Israel and Jews as white colonizers, et cetera. And Los Angeles has the largest Middle Eastern Jewish expat community, not only Iranian Jews, Iraqi, Moroccan, et cetera. And the way they portrayed Jews as only being Ashkenazi, they didn't even use that word. They said white and colonialist and upper middle class, et cetera. So here are Middle Eastern Jewish students. Thank God this ethnic studies curriculum did not pass, although some schools are appropriating it. But here they are reading in ethnic studies about Jews and not only getting a very anti-Semitic understanding of their own history, but completely negating and not even acknowledging that there are brown Jews in California and that our history is also really important. And that's something that AJC Los Angeles really fought back with a lot of other Jewish organizations in Los Angeles to make sure not only that ethnic studies curriculum didn't see the light of day because of its anti-Semitism, but with Jemena and other Jewish organizations that the Sephardi Mizrahi voice was included in that. So it's becoming a lot more popular. But I always say to my Ashkenazi Jewish studies scholars, when was the last time you advocated for a Mizrahi full-time tenure track position in Jewish studies at your university? And they're silent. So, okay, let's move on.
Saba, I wanted to interrupt you because I do want to, I don't think this has been mentioned yet. Each episode of the podcast focuses on a country or someone from that country whose family came from that country. But I also interview a scholar and weave the scholar's perspective and the context in with the personal stories, the memories, because personal memories are personal, right?
Yes. Yes.
They have a perspective. Memory is shaped by time and experiences, and the scholars have really come in and given a really good kind of 30,000 foot view of what the history was in that region at that time, and just kind of what the history books say. And I think that is so important to make sure that these stories are framed in a scholarly way as well, because I think knowledge is power.
Absolutely, Manya. And that's why one of the wonderful things about this podcast is the personal and the historical placed together. Carol, can I ask you some personal questions about growing up in the UK? And I think a lot of first generation people could relate to this. So what was it like for you navigating a hybrid identity where you're living in between these two worlds, one that was very British, as you said, with your father, and one that was very Iraqi in the home? And as someone who really looks at women in the Middle East, was there a gendered aspect to this? Did your parents follow traditional Iraqi ideology of what was appropriate for an Iraqi Jewish woman? And how do they feel about you becoming a musician, a cartoonist, an author? And, these aren't typical traditional roles within Middle Eastern Jewish women's,
Yeah,
canon of jobs.
I know, Saba. You understand this. It was tricky. I had one world at home, and then I had one world at school. And at school, I was the English girl in a girls' school. There were about 900 girls, 30 of whom were Jewish, and I was the only one Mizrahi. So I was a minority within a minority. So already, that's one thing. And then at home, having to live up to expectations. I mean, my parents were my father was something else. He was more than a generation older than my mother. He didn't have children until he was in almost 60 for a start. So, but he was quite forward thinking, I think. My mother, she wanted to be a singer. She had a beautiful voice, but she always told me, her father wouldn't let her do it because it wasn't the thing for a woman to be a singer. It wasn't right. This was in Baghdad. So I kind of grew up with that feeling. But then when they saw that my passion was music and that's what made me happy, I think they kind of let go. I'm sorry, Mum. I'm sorry, Dad. I gave you such a hard time when I was a teenager. But they did come to concerts, and I think they were happy. I wish they would have lived long enough to see the book, because perhaps that might have brought them some joy. I don't know.
Have you been, have women reached out to you? Do you see more women than men? Or, in so many ways, you are such a great example for the community, especially for women.
Everybody, I mean, everybody who I asked to help me with this book has helped me with an open heart, men, women, whatever. Actually, what is interesting is an Iraqi academic, a female, came to me after the book was published, and she's asked me to do a project with her on Iraqi women of the present day. She saw my book and she thought this was a great way of telling history. So I've got another really interesting project coming up with Iraqi women.
Oh,
Sorry,
wonderful. Well, we can't wait to hear more about that when it comes to fruition. So that's great. Thank you. And Carol, I read in another interview that you did where you said one of our family members said, even if we go back to Iraq, it would be as Jewish ghosts. What does that mean? Because you do talk about one day going back.
Yeah. Well, it was when you kind of interview people who have left their home like they did, they can't see themselves going back. None of the people I asked wanted to go back. Why would we want to go back? They said it was our home, but look what they didn't want us there. So the only way you could go back was by being like a ghost, like being unseen. And I use that metaphor in my book. If you know my book, all my family in Baghdad are represented as ghosts. They're kind of slightly see-through. You can kind of put your hand through them. So they're still living there somehow, in the ether somehow.
Right. Carol, do we know, are there any Jews left in Iraq?
I believe there are 4.
Out
of a population of 150,000. There are now 4.
Yeah.
I think they're all elderly. I think they want to be left alone. They don't particularly want to be identified because they were offered a chance several times. I think at the time of the 2003 invasion of Iraq, it was offered to them, do you want to leave? And they all said no, they wanted to die in Iraq. So I guess that's how it is.
Yes. Oftentimes people ask me how many Jews are left in Iran. And I say, oh, it's a huge number. It's 10,000 or something like that, because we don't know the actual number, but in the thousands. And, the non-Jewish community is always shocked because they're like, that's not big in a country with 80 million plus people. And I said, well, when there's, 2 left in Egypt and 4 left in Iraq and 1 left in Afghanistan, it is a really large number. It's the largest number outside of Israel. And very similarly, they just want to be left alone. Absolutely. Carol, you, a lot of Iraqi Jews went to the UK, but a lot went to Israel, and it was a huge culture shock for them because they went from being upper middle class Iraqi citizens to then moving to Israel and living in the Mahabharot. Can you talk about that? Can you even describe what a Mahabharot is for our viewers and listeners who don't know?
Well, when you remember that 120,000 Jews left Iraq between 1950 and 1951, and nearly all of them ended up in Israel, the new state. and where they're going to put all these people, and not to mention the Jews coming from other Arab lands and Iran. So they ended up in tent cities, basically in the desert outside, and it must have been brutal for them to live in a tent for years until you could get a place. And also speaking the language of Arabic, with the culture, with an Arabic culture, for example, with Arabic music as well, they were regarded as kind of the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could understand why people in Israel would think that, especially Jews from Europe, because for all they've been told is that Arabs are our enemies. And here are a load of people who come and they don't speak any Hebrew, and they're just all talking Arabic. This is, language of the enemy. I think it took an awful long time. And a lot of my family didn't really talk much about what they went through. But again, they just resolutely went forward. It was like, okay, now we start again. We start new. We're in Israel. Wherever they landed, they started again quietly and just did it.
Right. And you just did it. And that's what you see a lot. It's just the quiet, put your head down and just survive and move on. And Manya, we'll end with the last question for you before we move on to the audience. You did such an amazing job with this podcast. You really dove deep into it. You have an honorary PhD in Mizrahi history at this point. What did you take away from this, and how does it inspire you for future podcast ideas?
So I hardly have a PhD in this, not even close. But I did learn a lot, and there were a lot of takeaways for this project. I think that each story is different, and each story I had a different takeaway. We get into those tent cities in the episode on Yemen. We talk about the stateless in Egypt. We get into all of those issues. I'll say, for my conversation with you, Carol, I mean, I really the opportunities for reconciliation really came through. I mean, these friendships that you've made, and the people in Iraq who found you and want to know more. I think that and want to know with clear eyes, right? They don't want to know just the fond memories of everyone living side by side peacefully, in finger quotes. They want to know the real story. They want to know what their ancestors did and how people were treated, and they seem to want to make amends for that and seek reconciliation. Now, is that a majority? Is that the regimes and the people who are in charge? We'll see, right? But I just think the opportunity for reconciliation really rang from our conversation. But also the resilience. I mean, yes, people gave up a lot and lived in these tent cities, or gave up a lot and moved to Rome, and just made a life. And didn't just make a life, they thrived and they contributed to society in amazing ways. And their children and their grandchildren have contributed in amazing ways, through the arts and through literature and diplomacy, and just really went on to build amazing lives. Yes, I think you should be looking back, and you shouldn't leave the past in the past, but moving forward is a wonderful quality as well, and the resilience of this community to do that. And I would say last, my takeaway is Israel. I mean, in many ways, in many of these regions, there were hostilities because of the creation of Israel. But it's such a good thing that Israel existed, because in Egypt, for example, there were people who had been there for generations who were suddenly found themselves stateless, but they weren't, right? I mean, they had a Jewish state. The Jewish state was under attack by Egypt, but just that, it's a wonderful thing that Israel did exist as a refuge for so many of these people to go to. So those were my takeaways from the project.
Thank you so much, Manya, and thank you, Carol. What we'll do now is move on to some questions, and Claire, I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you. Our first question comes from Philip Barber in New York, who's asking, what role did Israel really play in all of this? Was it Was its creation the reason behind the violence against the Jews or in response to it? And Manya, I'll start with you.
Well, yeah, that was my that was one of the takeaways, right? Yes, that it did the creation of Israel in 1948. You know, they were attacked by Arab nations the day after they declared independence. I mean, there was definitely hostility in those countries as well. Jewish communities were targeted, whether they were Zionist or not. They were targeted, and it led to their ouster or denial of citizenship. But it was not a response to all of this. It was a response to a refugee crisis, and it ended up being there for this particular refugee crisis across the Middle East and North Africa, as these countries reacted to its creation and then sent these communities searching for home.
Thank you. Carol, the next question is for you from Sam in Atlanta. Manya shared her takeaways. I'm curious, from these forgotten exoduses, what else can we be doing to make sure all of these stories are really at the forefront?
Well, I always say to people, if I ever do a talk or anything, I say to the younger generation, ask your parents, ask your grandparents for their stories. Get them talking, record them, you know, and let's kind of keep all the histories so that we know them, so we can pass them down, so that more and more people know about it.
Thank you. Excuse me. Our next question comes from Sarah in Chicago. What can we do to help share your story? How can we help Carol publish more of your books? How can we convince teachers around the world to share this history?
It's a great question. How can we help you, Carol?
I don't know. I guess buy the book. Unfortunately it's not yet available in North America. We're looking for a North American publisher at the moment. My agent is looking. The middle grade book will be out hopefully next year in North America, but the Wolf of Baghdad is yet to find a home. So I'm hoping that will come soon. I mean, just getting the word out. On my website, you can see, you can download or rent the video of the motion comic, which is the animated version of my book. And I believe you can probably get it. I think Barnes & Noble have got copies as well, somewhere along the line. But yes, just tell people. I'd be very grateful. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you. Oh,
go
ahead.
I don't know if you can see. I was going to try to show the cover of the book, but I was able to order the wolf. There you go. That's much better. I was able to order it off of Amazon. So it was actually really easy for me to get, Carol. So I encourage everybody to order it, and to seek out the soundtrack on Carol's website, and watch that motion comic.
Carol, I use the book Persepolis in one of my courses, and I use the book and show the movie. So I hope that one day this will also be turned into a movie like Persepolis was, because it'd be a wonderful tool to also use in classes.
I hope so too. I mean, it's just our story. It's one family story that kind of seems to have touched a lot of people. We deal in basically, you know, home. Where is home? You know, where is our home? What do we think about home? Kind of, that's the big question, really. And it resonates with a lot of people, especially of those, even if they've come from other countries and have their parents have come to a third country and started another home there. It's that feeling of where do I belong, you know?
Right, absolutely.
I also just love the graphic nature of this story. Carol, I don't know if I should advertise this, but my 8-year-old son loves your book.
Wow.
Picked it up and read it several times. I've questioned the wisdom of letting him read about such a trauma, but he's wise beyond his years and seems to be able to handle it. But he keeps picking it up and asking me questions because he's into graphic novels, right? And so I just think the graphic nature of this, graphic meaning the artistic approach to this storytelling is just, it's so powerful. It's just so powerful.
Carol, may I ask you, why did you choose a graphic novel? Why did you choose that venue?
Well, I'm a cartoonist. I mean, I do what I do is just gag cartoons. I've been published in places like the New Yorker, Private Eye, like kind of single panel gag cartoons. And then when the opportunity came to do a short story it was actually, the theme was origin stories, and it was for a feminist comics anthology in America called The Strumpet. And they said 3-page stories on your origins, send them in. And I did a short one, which actually ended up in the back of the book. And I called it Deep Home. And it was about where I belong, where is my home. And I thought I could just maybe elongate that and fill it out into more of a thing that encompasses my whole family. And that's how the wolf became the wolf.
Wonderful, thank you.
And Carol, our last question before I turn it over to you, Manya. What's next? Are you going to continue writing about these stories?
Yeah, my next book, which is with my agent right now, it's called Burma by Accordion. And it's story of my father's family who ended up in Burma, would you believe? A lot of the Iraqi Jews went east. Some of them went to India, and a couple of thousand, went to Burma. And just before lockdown, I went there and I followed the story of one of my father's cousins who was an accordionist. I didn't know this until recently. And when the Japanese invaded Burma in 1942, hundreds of thousands of refugees were created, amongst them this small Jewish community, and they all fled. And he fled from Mandalay to India with his accordion on his back. So I decided to recreate his journey, and I did the same trek that he did. And I played my accordion to many bemused villagers in Myanmar. And I wrote also another graphic memoir about his journey, and also intertwined with my own. So that will be the next book.
Thank you, Manya. All you.
Oh, it sounds like a great topic for another podcast. Well, I want to thank everybody here. I want to thank AJC for letting me produce this podcast with an amazing team of people. Atara Lakritz is the producer of People of the Pod, as well as The Forgotten Exodus, and she's just really she's a genius. And so I just want to thank her publicly here. And Saba, I want to thank you as well. I mean, you have been our AJC's resident expert in this topic. The audience should know that you have edited a book on Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews in America. You wrote a book, as you mentioned, From the Shahs to Los Angeles: 3 Generations of Iranian Jewish Women Between Religion and Culture. You have been an incredible inspiration for this as well. And I should also mention you are our scholar in the Iran episode, which will air in just several weeks. So I want to encourage all of our viewers to subscribe or follow The Forgotten Exodus wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Just search for The Forgotten Exodus. We're there. And please subscribe so that you can get alerts whenever a new episode goes up, which will happen every Monday for the next 5 weeks. So thank you so much for giving us a chance to talk about how it all came about. And Carol, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you so much, AJC, for giving me this wonderful opportunity. I'm so grateful. And for all the people who've attended today, thank you so much for listening to us.
Thank you, Carol, Manya, and Saba, for sharing your stories and insights with us on Advocacy Anywhere. And thank you to our global audience for tuning in today. Be sure to listen next Monday to the new episode of The Forgotten Exodus, now the #1 Jewish podcast in America, where we'll hear from Israeli Olympic medalist Shahar Suberi on his family's escape from Yemen to Israel 60 years ago. As Manya said, you can follow on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. And you can learn more at ajc.org/forgottenexodus. Thank you again. Goodbye.